So good morning, everybody. While we just wait maybe another minute or so to see if anybody else joins us, I wanted to thank you so much for spending a little bit of time. Sheila in chat, thank you. Good morning to you. It really is a joy to have each of you join me. There's been so many interesting adjustments and changes that have happened this year that I just kind of got to the point within my organization that I started to think about what are some new and maybe interesting ways in which we could uplift one another through all of the changes that seem to be happening in society. And so if folks like me can offer up some interesting information or research or pieces of data that can help somebody else or help you, help your organizations, whatever that might be, I just thought that now would be the time to begin uplifting people. There's just so much stuff happening in society. I thought, well, let's start now. So I'm gonna try to share my screen and juggle letting people in at the same time. Everybody should be able to see the opening slide from the presentation. Does it say finding generational similarities on the front there? Shake your head yes if it does. Everybody see that? Not see that? Okay, Marissa, thank you. Checking to see if anybody else is in the waiting room. Nobody yet. All right, so, okay, good. So I'm gonna start right now, just to keep us on pace, so if we can finish up in the next hour or so. There have been, obviously, like I just said, thank you so much. There's been so many interesting things that have happened this year, and what I want to be able to do today is to kind of look at things through maybe a little bit of a different lens than what I think many people in society to do. So if you're joining me today, right now, live, or if you're watching this recording later, thank you so much and welcome. You can see the picture on the right is a picture of me, I think around age 4.5 or 5. And I'm going to talk about the importance of that phase of life to all of us, regardless of what generation we're in, about halfway through our presentation. And so if you don't know me, I'm a speaker, leadership consultant, executive coach, and my work is to guide leaders through really big changes, not only in their lives, but also try to adjust organizational culture. So my role is oftentimes moving people from a place of disengagement to clarity, or maybe from fear to confidence. And my mission is really about unlocking human potential. And, you know, when I think about some of my core values and how I distribute time, like I really do value authenticity and growth and spirituality, and try to find ways to bake those into the work that I do to uplift and guide people. So I want to make sure that you guys had that a little bit of awareness of me. Maybe why don't we open up the chat real quick? So open up chat for yourself, and I want you to answer a quick question. So during the stay-at-home orders, you know, what is a phrase that you have heard most often? So go ahead and take a second and enter it into chat. I just want to see from the last 6 months, what are some of the things that you're hearing most often, maybe in the office or maybe with your friends? So in the last 6 months, what are you hearing most often? Okay, we're all in this together. The new normal, it's going to be fine. It's going to be great. Don't forget your mask. It's not work from home, but home at work. Another good one. I love Sheila's, you're on mute. I think many people have said that. Or another one from Shine, learning to pivot. There are so many interesting things I think that we have to consider, is that as time does evolve and change, the things that we kind of see as being commonplace also evolve and change with them. So in the next 55 minutes, I'm going to cover these 5 things in the lower right-hand corner of the screen with you. I want to be able to make sure that we talk about some examples of some of the things that the media and some things culturally that just happened that kind of serve to divide us a little bit. And I'm going to talk through those examples. I'm going to go a little bit about, talk through a little bit about some of the differences that actually do exist, but I also want to cover 5 common ways or 5 similarities to really help us all see that we're probably more similar than we are dissimilar. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about meeting structures. Hopefully that will help you in your day-to-day interactions with people close to you, and then give you just a little bit of a look at my book that I'm going to be publishing on January 1st. So with that, I'm going to open up Menteemeter. I want you to grab your phones, and I want you to go in your browser to a website, menti.com. So grab your phone, open up your browser, go to menti.com. And when you get to that page, you should see a screen that will allow you to enter in a 7-digit code. And at the top of my screen, you'll see the code. It's 5704104. And then after you enter that and hit submit, you'll be asked a question. And the question is quite simply, what generation are you a part of? No right or wrong answer. You can only choose one, but just genuinely interested to see on the call today, where are we coming from generationally? Okay, looks like most everybody has responded. So on the call today, essentially from baby boomers, Generation X, and a few more from the millennial generation, which is great. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit through the lens of a couple of examples. So I'm going to ask you a few questions as we're going through this. I'm going to read this out loud just so that we all know. So on the screen are 2 paragraphs that are found in a magazine publication. And the first paragraph from Ernie, who is the uncle, and his quote is, "What is the game? The same game as the college game or the politics game. The name of the game is Beat Your Father at Building a Better World for Your Son. Richie cannot accept the concept that anything so dependent on existing institutions can leave a man free to think and act as he pleases in private life. Yes, all businessmen I know are free thinkers and intellectually curious, knowledgeable, and more interested in making a mark than in making a buck." Now, from Ricky, in this case, who is the nephew, he says, "Partly, I'm lazy. I don't feel like working this summer. I'm writing a book and taking a history course at Columbia. Even the dullest art history book gives me a greater sense of freedom than being imprisoned in an office. I don't feel like being confined. I want my time to be at my own disposal. I suppose I'm spoiled. Perhaps I'm copping out." So in the chat, what I want you to do is I want you to answer real quick, what generation do you think Ricky was born into? What generation is he from? So in chat, tell me what generation you think Ricky is from. Okay, Gen Z, Millennial, Z. Somebody says X. Another person says Z. Okay, Boomer, Millennial, but could be any, right? Ernie's a baby boomer. Okay, Tyler says X. Ricky maybe Millennial. Okay, so I'm going to advance to the next slide. So these 2 quotes were pulled from the May 17th, 1968 magazine edition of Life magazine. And Ernie, in this case, is featured in the article, and he happens to be a traditionalist, somebody who was born between the year 1900 and the year 1945. And Ricky happens to be a baby boomer, somebody born between 46 and 63, 64. Okay, so let's do another one. Here's another quote from another magazine, and it says, "Lazy, entitled, selfish, shallow, unambitious shoegazers who have trouble making decisions. They would rather hike in the Himalayas than climb a corporate ladder. They crave entertainment, but their attention span is as short as one zap of a TV dial. They postpone marriage because they dread divorce. They sneer at Range Rovers and Rolexes. What they hold dear are family life, activism, national parks, penny loafers, and mountain bikes." So same question in chat. What is the generation of the person who's being described in this paragraph? What do you guys think? Enter it into chat. Okay, a couple Z's, X again, Z. Everybody loves penny loafers, Doug, I think. Another person says Z. Okay, anybody else? Marissa says Z, but penny loafers is kind of questionable. I agree. Okay, so this particular quote came from the July 16th, 1990 edition of Time. And the article was written by a baby boomer, and it is describing somebody who was born into Generation X. Okay, so again, another example of how an older generation person, a more experienced generation person, has a particular opinion that uses nearly the exact same language of a person who comes from the next generation. Okay, we're going to do one more. And I'll read this one out aloud as well. So this comes from a more recent article. And this one says, they have been depicted more recently by employers, professors, and earnestly concerned mental health experts as entitled whiners who have been spoiled by parents who overstoked their self-esteem, teachers who granted undeserved A's, and sports coaches who bestowed trophies upon any player who showed up. As they've entered adulthood, they have inspired a number of books on how unmanageable they are in the workplace with their ubiquitous iPods and flip-flops and inability to take criticism. Stories abound about them as college students requiring 24/7 email access to professors and running to mom and dad for help with papers to contest a bad grade. A consensus has emerged that psychologically, they're a generation of basket cases, profoundly narcissistic and deprived of a sense of agency by their anxiously over-involved parents. In short, they could be called a nation of wimps. So what do you guys think? Enter into chat this time, and this is the last one. Who is this describing? So now we're a little bit more consistent in millennials. Perhaps you're finding out the pattern to my questioning, which is great. So a couple of you said Z, a couple of you said millennial. Another one, Z. I'm going to close the chat box and go to the next slide. So this was pulled from a May 2010 article in the New York Times, and the author is from Generation X, and she is describing a millennial, a Generation Y person. And so when we think about our initial gut response to what each of those things were, what you saw was that there is a common language that's utilized from basically the late 1960s to the 1990s to 2010. And the language has always been that the next generation is relatively lazy or narcissistic or focused on something. And that may be true for some individuals within that generation, but it's not true across the entire generation. And so if your guess was wrong, just think a little bit about what might have shaped your beliefs. Was it your family? Was it the media? Was it culture that you engage in a relatively consistent basis? But just kind of ask yourself, why is it that our culture or our media or people in power relatively consistently push a narrative that is relatively derogatory or negative about the next generation, right? And the thing that I've always found bizarre about that is that they're the parents of the next generation, right? So why is it that they say relatively negative or destructive things about the upcoming generation when they're the parents of those exact same people? So just something to keep into the back of your brain as you think about how has the divide and the overfocus on generational differences happened in our society. So grab your phone again. Let's do another Mentimeter question. I'm going to advance this. And so this question is, how many hours per day do you view a screen? Could be a television, all right, could be your phone, could be some sense of media through an iPad or some sort of a pad. And the options are 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. So how many hours per day are you viewing a screen? Okay, so for everybody who has responded thus far, it looks like about 56% of the people on the call are right about 12 hours per day. And for that person who did say 3, or a couple people who did say 3, that's pretty good, right? To think about how little time they actually spend on a screen. So keep these numbers in mind, right? When you think about the number of hours that we spend on a screen. I'm going to go back to my slides, but thank you so much for responding to that. And what we want to look at here are a couple of things that really help to drive home how we are taught to believe something specific about a topic or a generation. And so Nielsen, which is known as being kind of the ratings agency for understanding the number of people that watch a specific television show, in 2018, they released what is called the Total Audience Report. Now, again, this is from 2018, so this is pre-coronavirus. And they found that in 2018, the average American was watching 12 hours and 9 minutes on average per day of screen, whether that was television or whether that was phone or whether that was iPad. Okay, so for those of you, about 56% of us, were kind of in that same bucket that we spend roughly that amount of time. Now, the interesting thing about the Nielsen Total Audience Report was that was separate from work, right? So that excluded work. And so think about how much more time, if you happen to be working on a screen, that could be spent there. So maybe there's another 6, 7, or 8 hours. So excluding work, we're spending roughly 12 hours a day connected to some sort of a screen. Now, for somebody to keep your attention on that screen, there are 3 things on my screen to help you be aware of what those things mean. And so on the far left, mere exposure effect, it basically came from a psychologist named Robert Zonchik. And his research showed that if we watch, hear, or read the same message repeatedly, we unconsciously believe the message, even if we consciously disagree with it. Right? So if we're listening to some message repeatedly in the background in our house or on our phone for 12 hours, even if we don't necessarily like the message, what's happening is that subconsciously, unconsciously, we're beginning to believe it. So just be mindful of the fact that even if the television screen is on, or if your iPad or your phone screen is on, we're absorbing that information unconsciously and we're beginning to like it. Now, in the center, another way that people keep your attention is called the recency effect. And this one is a cognitive bias in which, an item or an idea or an argument that came recently, or very last item in a series of items, they're remembered more clearly than those items that came first, right? So the more consistently that a message is delivered, the more it is that you're going to remember it, especially if it's the most recent thing that you're holding in your mind. So it's going to be more clear in your memory the more recent it is. So if our TVs or screens are on for 12 hours a day, the recency effect is going to take hold, and we're going to find things to be true unconsciously that we believe to be untrue consciously. And on the right-hand side, the law of authority, if you haven't read Robert Cialdini's book called Influence, I would encourage you to consider it. And one of his 6 laws of influence is called the law of authority. And what this states is that people tend to follow other people who are credible or knowledgeable and are deemed experts in some field. And the reason why that exists is because it is perceived in our brains that that expert can offer a shortcut to a good decision that we might not have found ourselves, or it might have taken us a long time to be able to discover ourselves. So it's important to understand is that we have 12 hours, sometimes more, sometimes less of screen time. And there are interesting psychological effects that are impacting our capacity to be able to weed out specific information, or it's actually affecting our capacity to believe things in our own way, because we're subconsciously absorbing information that we may consciously disagree with. So I do want to be respectful and honor that there are differences that exist across generations and even within generations. So in our society, we tend to focus a little bit upon each generation is different, and there are differences, don't get me wrong, but there are also differences within a generation. And so I've listed a few there under the within a generation heading. So anything from a behavioral or communication style like the DISC or the Myers-Briggs or the Emergenetics or StrengthsFinder 2.0, there's any number of those that exist, and anybody within a generation can have a different style. Each of us probably has a different set of core values. We're all probably motivated by something unique or different. We've all been impacted by the local culture in which we were raised, or the geography in which we were raised. Things in America are pretty different than they are in China, than they are in New Zealand, or that they are in places like Italy. So local culture can have a big difference within a generation as well. There are more than 7,000 recognized religions on the planet, according to ethnology. So religion and spirituality can be quite different within a generation as well. Socioeconomic status can be different within a religion. Different places that are much more advanced, much more first world, versus certain countries and territories that might be deemed second or third world, could be quite a few differences there. Language, of course, and then some of the more common things recognized, especially in first world countries, around gender, age, ethnicity, things like that. So there are differences across generations, and there are differences within a generation. Now, where it says across generations, I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention, like, yes, all of those things above do matter, but let's also take into consideration things that have been happening over a period of 100 to 150 years, right? So the traditionalists, those folks born between 1900 and 1945, the economic circumstances they were raised in are quite a bit different than the economic circumstances that a millennial or somebody in Gen Z is being raised in. So there are big differences there from generation to generation. Same thing with technological advancement, right? People born in the traditionalist generation we're basically being raised at a time where the transition was made to start using a car, motorized vehicle, much more often. Whereas now people that are Gen Z, there are basically now cars that drive themselves, right? So we're at a very, very different time in technology. Globalization is also a big deal, right? We can travel prior to coronavirus. We could travel most anywhere in the world relatively cheaply, considering that there are so many different international airports and hubs of transportation via water. We can get most anywhere pretty quickly. I'd also like to argue that there's probably some differences around the expanding consciousness, which is a little bit of the stuff that I talk about in my book, which I'll share with you, of course, later. But also access to information, right? It wasn't until 1995 that the World Wide Web even existed. So different generations have had access to different information. Sometimes they would have an Encyclopedia Britannica in their house, or sometimes they'd have to go to the local library, or perhaps their university's library. But right now, through our mobile devices, we each have the capacity to be able to gain access to the world's information completely for free. So lots of different ways that we certainly can be different within and across generations. So my idea, my theory is that there's actually more in common. And here are the 5 kind of similarities or ways that I think people are the same. So I'm going to give you some examples and research around credibility. I'm going to talk about 10 principles and talk a little bit about human needs, life stages, and brainwaves. But before I dive into that, grab your phone. I'm going to do another quick polling question and see your perspective here. So the question is, what brainwave state are you in right now? There's 5 options on your screen. Number 1's gamma, which is a version of expanded consciousness. Number 2, beta, which is being in concentration and learning. 3, alpha, which is being relaxed or reflective. Theta is dreaming or being in a flow state. And then delta is being in a deep healing sleep. So go ahead and take a second to respond to that. Okay, so looks like most everybody has had a chance to respond. And I love that most of you have responded beta, a couple of you in the state of gamma, which I think is wonderful. So thank you for taking a few moments to respond. Let me describe this just a bit more. And so I think that question got out of order. I'm sorry about that. Let's go down to brainwaves. I'll come back. So this is a good look at Dr. Bruce Lipton and his research with regards to the 5 brainwave states. And so Dr. Bruce Lipton in 1971 was given his PhD in cell biology. So he's trained or taught at the University of Texas, the University of Wisconsin, Penn State, John F. Kennedy University, published 10 books, published in lots of articles. And what he has been doing for almost 5 decades as technology has progressed is more recently he's used what's called an electroencephalogram. And those readings show essentially brainwave activity at different phases in our life. And so through his research, what he has found is that from birth until age 6, the human brain is in the lower 2 phases, predominantly in theta. So from birth until age 6, we are in delta and theta predominantly. But after age 6, the brain moves into beta, which is what most of the people on the call today said that they were in. So you guys were correct. Now, the interesting thing about Lipton's research is that when we are in delta or theta, our brains are like a supercomputer sponge. So everything that happens in the environment around us is automatically baked into our subconscious, and we then begin to process our life around us based on that information. So from birth until age 6, we are learning and learning and learning and learning and learning from our parents and from our family and from our churches and from our school and from people around us, from our communities. And we then know that that is what allows for us to be accepted into society. So after age 6, we transition into beta. And what happens is that in beta state, we pull from those subconscious beliefs and relive them unknowingly, unconsciously, day after day after day for the rest of our lives. Now, the reason that this is important is that our subconscious, the human subconscious, according to Lipton and another doctor, found that the subconscious processes 400 billion bits of information per second, but the conscious mind only processes 2,000 bits per second. Okay, so your subconscious is a supercomputer that it involuntarily kind of guides us and tells us where to go. But our conscious brain is not that supercomputer, right? And it deals with things that are a little bit more relevant to us in the moment on the spot. So be mindful of that, is that the things that all generations learn between birth and age 6 are the things that they then unconsciously, unknowingly do and repeat for the rest of their lives. So if you were to think back to that time, into your community or into the people that you were spending a lot of time with, the things that they believed and did, you're going to unknowingly repeat quite often. So if you happen to meet somebody from a different generation and you're interested in learning a little bit more about them, and you want to know maybe a little bit more about their brain states, there are a couple questions I would encourage you to ask them. So one of the questions might be, what did your parents do that you now find yourself doing? Or how have you broken your generational curses, right? Those things that your parents taught you that you didn't like, how have you stopped doing them? Or when you take a little bit of time for reflection or prayer or stillness, what do you do to find stillness in reflection, prayer? So even if the person's from a different generation, these are really basic questions that you can ask to make sure that you're deepening the relationship with the person and coming back to center to learn a little bit more about them. So even though the question in the slide got a little bit out of order, I'm sorry about that, but still important points to make. I'm going to go back to see if what poll, go back to the polling question here real quick. I'm going to pop up another one to see if it will work this time. Okay, here's a go. So grab your phone. Let's do another polling question. We'll see if we can get this in order this time. So the question is of the 5 people on the screen, who do you believe is most credible? So take a look at those options that are on your phone and answer it. Okay, so for those of us, and remember we were mainly Gen X and Gen Y from the folks on the call today. And so about 58-60% of us believe or do trust or find most credible a person like ourselves. So some of us say an entrepreneur, some of us say government official, some of us say academic expert. All are good and can be very, very credible. But I'm going to show you a report here from Edelman. So if you haven't heard of Edelman, it's an international public relations agency. And they did a study in 2019, and it was done with 33,000 respondents in 27 different countries and markets. And the question that they asked, and you can kind of see it at the bottom there, and what they asked was, when you're forming an opinion of a company, if you heard information about that company from each of the persons on the screen, how credible would the information be? Okay, so really trying to assess and understand, do you trust, do you respect, do you find that information coming from that person to be credible? And so you can see that on the right-hand side, there are government officials and journalists, boards of directors and CEOs that those 33,000 people didn't necessarily find to be as credible, which is quite similar to what you had just responded to in the Menteemeter question. Now, if you look on the left, the 3 people there, company technical expert, academic expert, and quote unquote, a person like yourself, they're all rising in popularity literally across the world. And so each of the generations that exist today were represented in the study, and we have multiple generations even represented on today's call. But what's important to understand is that there's a decentralization occurring across the entire world, where we used to believe in centralized pieces of information that came from hierarchical structures and institutions. We are now beginning to find more decentralized means and ways to collect information. Maybe it's a Yelp review, or maybe it's a review that you catch on Amazon. Maybe it's a question that you put on a social media post to get advice or feedback about somebody that you need to service something in your home. We more and more and more, regardless of generation, are trusting people like ourselves. Okay, so it's important to recognize that that shift is occurring in society. So if that happens to be you, or if you're watching another person inside your organization, you want to engage them in some new or different way, I would find those people inside your organization, or maybe a friend or a family member, And if you want to learn a little bit more about them, ask them specific questions about, why do you enjoy your area of expertise? Why is it important to you? Why do you enjoy learning that? How, when and how did you know it was going to become your career? Right. And in asking these questions, we're trying to deepen the bond and form some sort of a meaningful relationship with the person in a way that they see you like them. Now, you could also ask a person that's from a different generation, can you walk me through your journey to today? Or what are some of the most important lessons you've learned through your life? All really basic questions, but all great door openers to be able to get a person to discuss more things about their life with you. So one of the ways that all generations are the same is that there's this decentralization occurring, and we're tending to trust people like us more than we find credible or trust people that used to have positions of power. So just keep an eye out for that in your respective roles at work. We also mentioned the 10 principles. Here they are in your screen. This book is called Retiring the Generation Gap, and it was written by Jennifer J. Deal. And she is a doctor that works for the Center for Creative Leadership, published back in 2008. And what I've loved about Jennifer's work is that she found 10 principles in which all humans, regardless of generation, are the same. And you can see them there on the screen, that there's any of these, and take a look at them and kind of think about and say, which one probably matters most to you? Which one are you dealing with the most for yourself right now? And so if you don't mind, in the chat box, just put in there and say, which of these principles do you think is the one that is true across every generation? Okay, which do you think is the most true across every generation? And enter that into chat. Okay, a couple people 6, one person said 2, somebody 3, a couple 3s, 3 3s so far. So I've got 6, 2, and 3. Doug says all of them. Yes, true. And I'll let me just speak to each of them just for a second, especially number 6. In my work, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our discussion, is that I help people at the point of change, or I help facilitate cultural organizational change. And that's a lot of the work that I do. And principle number 6 is undoubtedly the one that comes up the most. And it's not so much that people dislike change, because most can do okay with it. The difference is that people don't like when change is bestowed upon them, and they have no say in the change occurring. So the trick as a leader is to make sure that when some sort of organizational adjustment or change is coming, that you get people involved as early as possible in the change process to make sure that it occurs smoothly and with their input, right? When a person is involved in the change process, they're much more likely to be committed to it and to do work in support of it. Okay, so that's a big one. Another one of the chats was for number 2. Everybody does want respect, right? And it is different because we all have different languages of appreciation, if you will. Some of us do like being recognized publicly. Some of us prefer to do it a little bit more privately and behind the scenes. Some of us like to receive gifts. Some of us just need the pat on the back. So we all want respect for working hard and doing well. And it's just a matter of making sure that we ask the right questions to know what those people might like. And a couple of you said principle number 3, which is about trust. And of course, with the Edelman material, we just covered this a little bit, but trust genuinely does matter, right? If you think about the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, the core of that particular pyramid is trust, and right, and really establishing trust. And the way that trust occurs is by vulnerably sharing bits and pieces of your story so that people can find the commonality between you and them powerfully. So what I would often ask a person from a different generation is, what's your favorite thing to learn about? Or what recent life change have you experienced? Or what is it that you value in a leader? Or what is it that's important to you to find in a leader? So when we look at these 10 principles, it's far simpler for us to be able to know how to help one another or ask the right questions of one another, because regardless of generation, we can find ways to give these things to people to make them feel safe, right? And that's key. So let's go to next. Now, next one I want to talk about is human needs. And you probably have seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs because Abraham Maslow, his initial iteration of it was 5 levels. And so one of the things that is important to understand is that when he passed, I think it was in 1970, just a couple years before he passed, he added 3 levels to his hierarchy of needs. And that's the top 3 levels that you see on the screen. So Maslow's hierarchy is actually 8 levels. And so all humans go through this process of ascending from the bottom to the top. So regardless of generation, all humans are going to want to rise from the bottom to the top. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here, and you can see the different generations listed on the left-hand side, and I've associated them with a different need based on the time in human history that they were born. And the reason why I do that is society clearly in the last 100 to 150 years has advanced pretty rapidly. So if you think about someone who was born between 1900 and 1945, especially in America, we were dealing with 2 world wars. We were dealing with famine. We were dealing with depression. The economy was a fraction of the size that it is. And so many Americans at that point in time were simply looking for the most basic biological or physiological needs. But as they helped to grow the economy and gave birth to the baby boomers, all of a sudden level 1 of Maslow's hierarchy was taken care of, and the baby boomers didn't need to fight for that in many cases. So now they started to design and create a society that was about safety and security. And so when you talk to a baby boomer today, you're likely to hear them talk about making sure that they have a good job that's stable, or that they built a strong retirement account, or that they paid off their house, or they're debt free, because they were born at a time in history where that core need was the focus of society. So then the baby boomers give birth to Generation X, and in some cases millennials. And you can see how when the next level of Maslow's hierarchy is met, all of a sudden now we don't have to worry about physiological or safety needs. We can start to focus in on, let's worry about being loved and cared for. How do we make sure that we form deep and meaningful relationships? Or for the millennials, those folks born between 80 and 95, they're a little bit more focused in on making sure that they have the right personality focus, reputation, achieving the right goals, having their own life's mission, whatever that might be. And so after whatever generation comes after Z, right, they're going to focus more on aesthetic things or self-actualization or helping other people. So the thing about this is that any person from any generation can go up and down Maslow's hierarchy depending on their circumstances at that point in time. But it is important to recognize that we are going to continue as a society to ascend up this, because each iteration of society has basically taken one of the lower levels of human needs off, because they've cured that. They've done such a good job designing society that we don't have to worry about that anymore. So when I think about communicating to somebody who might be a traditionalist or baby boomer or even Gen X, I try to figure out how can I ask them questions about the community that they were raised in, because that gives me insights into what was the human need that they were most focused on when they were young. Or you can ask them about their teenage years and what world events they remember most vividly, right? When I was young, I was born in 1980, so right around the year 2000, I was still had just turned 20. And I'll never forget where I was at the moment that the September 11th attacks had occurred. And it really stuck in with me at that particular point in time. So when people ask me about some of those younger years for me and the things that really were most defining, there are ultimately going to be similar responses for other people. Now, their responses might be different, but the emotions that underlie those things are certainly going to be the same. So another thing that I've asked people from a different generation is, what lessons did you learn, or what values are you trying to pass on to your children? And that gives us a bit of window into what core need they were raised in, or what core need they were addressing. So another way that we're all the same, right, is that we all have these kind of same core human needs. And if we come together well and collaborate well, we can help one another make sure that we continue to advance up this scale. So when we think about the next thing, I want to talk about Carl Jung. And I don't know if anybody on the call has done a Myers-Briggs type indicator, but Carl Jung was the developer of that. But he has also published a number of other books that have all been, I think, really well received, but haven't really gained a lot of popularity across society, but they should. And he came up with in one of his books this idea that there are 4 life phases that all humans experience or go through. And you can see them on the screen. And the reason why this is important is that when we think about one generation calling the next lazy, entitled, selfish, narcissistic, whatever those words are, what the person is doing is forgetting that he or she has entered into one of the next phases of life that the younger person hasn't made it to yet, right? That's all it is that more likely than not, the person who wrote those articles at the beginning of our time together today was probably in the warrior or the statement phase of their life. And they were describing somebody who was in the athlete phase. And that's all it is. It's just that we all go through it differently. So for those folks who are baby boomers, right, they began to get married and have children sometimes around age 20, 25. They did it a little bit younger than people who are millennials do now. Sometimes they do it in their late 20s and early 30s. And it's just because the way that society has advanced and evolved, they've stayed a little bit longer in the athlete or warrior phase than maybe previous generations did. So I love to look at my clients and the work that they're doing through this lens to try to understand which phase of life are they in right now, what lessons are they learning, and how do we make sure that we create the right experiential learning opportunities to move them from either the athlete or the warrior up to the warrior statement. Probably one of the best things that we could be doing for each other. So when I'm helping a client with this, I often ask them questions about, what are your most important goals, or how have you defined your life's legacy, or what is it? Or what challenges have you overcome to go from one phase to the next, or how is it that you're going to help others do the same? So there are many things that we can be asking of those around us, regardless of generation that they're coming from, to help understand what phase they're in and what we can do to help them matriculate to the next phase of their life. So I love Carl's work. It really does give us a good, strong foundation of the psychology that exists for many of us. So we've already gone through a couple of those 5 different things, ways that people are the same. And what I want to do is give you, in the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes that we have here, I'm going to give you a little bit about a meeting structure that you might be able to use, regardless of generation, a person that's on your team or peer or colleague. And we've used versions of this in a one-to-one setting, but also in a one-to-many setting. So it can be used with large groups as well. And it's built upon this idea that regardless of generation that you are, or regardless of generation that reports to you, there are kind of 5 areas or things that if we address them in each meeting, we're going to be in a place that provides for people to really feel heard, to really feel safe to take risks, to really be vulnerable with the things that they need to be, so that they genuinely enjoy working where they are. Now, if you follow Gallup, I think they stopped for a little while kind of tracking employee engagement scores because they've been roughly the same for so long. But at some point within the last year, they found out that employee engagement was still about 34, almost 35% across America, right? So that means that about 34, 35% of Americans that are working actually like their work. But that means about 65% don't. So this process, or these 5 steps, are kind of designed to help find a way to see if we can't get some sort of discussion going with people to help them genuinely like their work and be able to show up authentically day to day. And so what I'm advocating for is that when we have a dialogue with a person one-to-one or in a team setting, is that the first step is that we begin every meeting with some sort of celebration of wins or some sort of recognition of one another, right? So beginning every meeting with one individual is allowed to share his or her personal or professional wins, or we go around the room and we offer recognition of one another for the work that was great over the last 1 or 2 weeks, whatever that is. So that tends to set a much better mood within the meeting, or tone, if you will, because then we can start to talk about things that are just a little bit more difficult after we kind of recognize one another or share wins with one another. So the second step is a little bit about accountability, right? We got to communicate our progress on goals that we had agreed to. And for those of you that do lead teams or large teams of people, it's really important that people are held accountable to the things that they said they were going to do within the last week. And so whether you use a red, yellow, green stoplight process or some sort of metrics-driven goal, what is really important is that each person is allowed to verbalize what it is that they did to make progress on their goals at some point over the last couple of weeks, right? So if we can do that, right, we're going to hear about their journey, we're going to hear about their wins, we're going to hear about their roadblocks, we're going to hear about the things that they've accomplished, and we can see the trends that are existing within their work or within their department. Now, another thing that is a little bit new, number 3, is the core values. And this is something that I do with all of my clients. I make sure that we do a core values activity so that they know their top 5 or 6. But what we really want to do is find a way to have the employee, regardless of generation, living his or her own core values or living the organization's values, right? Because that's really the wave of the future. I did a webinar yesterday morning for a group, and Gallup had released some information to say that about 23% of respondents to that survey knew or practiced what their organization's core values were, right? So it's a very small percentage. So if we start to bake discussions of core values into our meetings, we get to honor each person, regardless of gender, regardless of age, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of any of the differences that we talked about at the beginning of today. We can now find a way to honor them for their uniqueness and their journey and their strengths and who they are. So if we start to bake a core values discussion into our meetings, we start to respect and honor one another in a new and better way. So step 4 would be is that we got to find a way as leaders, right, to remove those roadblocks for those people that are on our team. So whatever we can do to, remove or get around or through or over, whatever that might be, try to find ways to help those around us. And so it can be a peer helping a peer, or it can be us as a manager or a leader trying to find a way to help those around us by getting rid of those roadblocks, right? Oftentimes when we climb corporate ladders, our intellect becomes a lot less important than our emotional intelligence and our capacity to perceive problems and issues and take them off the plate. And the last step of a one-to-one or a mini group meeting is, how do we verbalize or commit to a plan? And many organizations that I've consulted with in the last couple of years have really struggled with this. And so accountability has been really hard for them. They've been financially successful, so they've kind of skated on their laurels in that way. But as they've had to shift strategy, especially over the last 6 months, we've really had to clamp down on non-compliant behavior by focusing in on how do we verbalize and commit to a plan. So make sure that you end every single meeting, either one-to-one or a group, by making sure that each person verbalizes exactly what they're going to do in the next week or two, and that you will follow up with them to make sure that they're doing it. So this is just something that's really easy that can work across any generation, and it helps us to kind of come back to center, to know that we are really in so many ways the same. So I'm going to put up one more polling question for you. So grab your phones again. And I want you to answer in free form text. So take a minute or two, whatever you need. When you think about some of the things we just talked about in the last 45 or 50 minutes, what was the thing that you learned that was most interesting to you? And you can free form your response. It's anonymous. Nobody's going to know. So just free form your response in there. And what was the thing that you took away from today? Okay, so a couple of you have said brainwave material. Somebody, Carl Jung, each generation does look at the next as lazy, and there's patterns of that over multiple decades. We can set up the right meetings through that 5-step process, the 5 similarities around commonalities. And you can answer multiple times if you wish. Again, another one about the meeting structures. So when I was thinking about and trying to design this presentation, right, it really was about recognizing that in society, there are certainly differences that exist. There is no doubt about that. But what I think we can also then think about and do a little bit is to think about there are so many ways in which we're the same. And so one of the things that I've been working on this past kind of like 6 months is many of the things that I had set up in October, November of 2019 around budgeting and around focus kind of all went out the window in March, and perhaps you've experienced that a little bit yourself. And so I redevoted some time this year to be a little bit more reflective and introspective and decided to write a book. And so on January 1st, I'm going to publish this book and put it out. But you can see on the right, the working title as of now is called I Know, and it's my process for how we awaken to what's within. So it'll be published as an ebook and as an audiobook. And really what it's going to be is 9 processes, right, that can empower anybody that reads it to transition from a life of believing that, you know, answers come from somewhere outside themselves to knowing that they can uncover the answers within themselves. And I just think we're at that really interesting point in human history where we're trusting people like ourselves more, or we're recognizing these 4 stages in life, or we're recognizing the 10 principles that Jennifer Deal talks about. And so we're being exposed to so much more information than we had ever been exposed to before. And so I wanted to be able to find a way to help people navigate those processes in a very safe way for themselves. And so throughout the book, I obviously give tons of research, give a lot of client stories, but also give literal 5-6 step processes that you can do alone, or you can do with somebody else if you wish, to make sure that you're advancing to that next level of your life for yourself in your own way. So you can see on the screen my contact information on the right. And I started our presentation with a pic of me at that very early stage in my life purposely, because there are so many things that happened in my journey, right, from birth until age 6, that I talk about throughout the entire book purposely, to say that there were many things that I learned subconsciously and unconsciously then that have informed me, that have helped me, that have allowed for me over the last 10 years to coach people across the globe. And I have standing calls with people in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and Italy and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and somebody in Auckland, New Zealand. And they're really helpful for me to get an understanding of what's happening all across the entire globe. So each of us does have highly unique journeys. And we have to find a way that regardless of what we see happening around us on a screen, we should honor the uniqueness that does exist. There's so much that we can learn from one another. There's no doubt about that. But I also think that there's a way for us to be able to see things in a new light, right? In a way that allows for us to recognize the commonalities and the similarities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to, I'm going to put this in the chat box so that you have it. There's a generational differences chart right here. I'm going to place this in the chat so that you can see it. It's one of the best resources that I've found for understanding the different beliefs and the different things, core values, attributes, things like that. I'm going to share that in the chat box right now so that you have it. And then I'm also going to put in the chat box this PDF, or a link to this PDF. It's kind of a summarized version of what it is that we just talked about in the last 50 minutes, but it actually has a little bit of homework that you can do and take away from some of the discussion that we've had today. So I'm going to open up the chat and put that in there for you all. Hold on one second. Okay, here's that in the chat. There's the organizational kind of differences chart. And then here is the PDF that you can download that helps just a little bit with understanding and summarizing some of the things that we discussed today. And then one final thing that I'll mention, and I'll open it up for any Q&A before the top of the hour here, is that in the bottom right-hand side, you can see save the date. I'm going to do another webinar on November the 19th, same time, 11 o'clock Arizona. And we're going to talk just a little bit more that day about processing loss. I think with things that are coming up in society, and I think some things that are going to come to light, we're going to be in a place where we're all going to be shedding something in our lives, whether it's an old way of life or a belief pattern or something. So I want to make sure that each of us has a way to be able to process these things in a good way. So let me, okay. Let me open it up for questions. And if you want to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to. Does anybody have comments or questions? I don't see any coming in. Okay, if you've got... Hi there.
Hi, Nancy. This is Nancy Stoddard.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi. Hey, thanks for all your work, Michael. It's wonderful to hear you and see you again. I'm an FEI person, so I'm definitely a fan.
Thank you.
going to people and getting our information and our credible information from people who are like ourselves doesn't speak very much to being open-minded about diversity. Is there a downside of being that way?
When I think Edelman was doing that research, they were saying a person like ourselves, and what they meant by that was, I think, and this is just my conjecture, I don't know if it's entirely true, you'd have to look at the report, is I don't think that they're necessarily doing that from the basis of gender or ethnicity or race or background in that way. I think it's a little bit more about people who have had similar life experiences. And so when people maybe believe the same thing or have similar experiences, or maybe they do have a similar disc profile, you're right. There can be potential issues that pop up if we navigate towards groups that all seem kind of similar to us. You're right. There could be problems with that. Don't get me wrong. But I also think that what it does is it teaches us all in the short term to feel okay with meeting people who might be really different than us, and we tend to find the commonality in that person, right? And so I think it's a double-edged sword and kind of can go both ways. That makes sense, Nancy?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm looking in the chat here, and I think it was Tanya that said, how do you help define core values in a meeting? Let me step off camera for a second. I'm going to show you something that I think will help. So 1 second. So to answer Tanya's question, let me see if you can see this. You should see a card deck. It says the peak values. So I believe it's on the back, thepeakfleet.com. And so these card decks are maybe $15 or $20. Tanya, they're relatively inexpensive. But when you buy a card deck from Brian and Jen's website, it allows for you to take basically 55 of these cards and whittle them down to your top 5 or 6. And so it's really a super fun activity because it forces you to think through the things that you are, or maybe that the employee close to you is. So I would do this activity with each member of the team, and then we would then have some sort of basis on which to be able to have discussion. Marissa asks, are there any favorite personality tests or exercises? So I just showed you the card deck. I'm certified to deliver the DISC assessment. So through Target Training International in North Scottsdale, they have a tool called the Talent Insights, and it does a mix. It does not only the DISC, but it also does a motivators assessment, which is quite similar to core values. So Marissa, if you have questions, I can send you a link to that. But I think it's ttisi.com is the website for them. But what I love about their assessment is that it looks at our outward behavior through the DISC and how we show up to people. But the motivators piece of the assessment looks at unobservable behavior that nobody else would know that we are motivated by, sometimes not even us. So that assessment can be administered pretty quickly, but it offers a ton of interesting information. Okay, so what else? Any other questions? Okay, are we good? If you have questions, obviously I've emailed you this morning, so please feel free to respond to that, or if you need additional resources, if there's anything else that I can provide to you, please let me know. Otherwise, I will bid you farewell and wish you a wonderful afternoon and day. So thank you so much for joining today.